You see a few pictures of the bridge in construction, then boom, from 1889 onwards, all the photographers are taking pictures of the skyline of St. Paul, of the shores on either side. The High Bridge becomes the platform for photographers around the Twin Cities. This isn't a particularly elegant example of that, but it is, I think, kind of a fun depiction of the neighborhood you're in, and it's one of the earliest pictures I have of this building. Here we are right here. And by the way, Jim, your outhouse is right here. You see the outhouses in the picture? These are kind of fun little structures.
What Tom didn't tell you, that he's the new kid on the block. This is 1857. I live directly across the street in the 1854 cottage, and so Tom's the new kid on the block. 1857. So yes, that is the outhouse, right towards Goodrich from my house, south of my house.
And of course, that's the wrought iron pedestrian rail that you see in the foreground in the image. So, again, Little Italy. Jim.
Living on a floodplain was not fun, but every other year you were underwater. You accessed your home by boat.
Oh.
And these folks, they're smart. They actually were living in houseboats. Both sides of the river were just crowded with houseboats. When you think of alternative ways of living in tiny houses, they knew what tiny houses were. My little cottage across the street, 600 square feet in 1854. Less than that, actually, in 1854. But anyway, the start of that settlement, which disappeared completely in the 1950s. The last house removed in 1960.
Well, the High Bridge also became a focal point of artists, and this particular one was notable because it was apparently drawn just a few days perhaps before. If you read the note there, it says, shortly after this sketch was made, a cyclone struck St. Paul and destroyed the span next to the bluff, August 1904. And in fact, on August 20th of 1984, a tornado ripped through the High Bridge and that section of St. Paul and tore, as the artist indicated, that longest span from the south end of the bridge.
How long was it out of commission?
A very large storm cell formed out near Fort Snelling. And out of that storm cell on that Saturday night, August 20th, 1904, around 8 o'clock, 2 funnel clouds descended. And that's very common if you've looked at pictures of tornadoes. 2 funnel clouds formed. One went across into the Midway area into Frogtown. The other one used that cool updraft of the river to fuel it. And when it met the High Bridge, the winds exceeded 200 miles an hour at the High Bridge. And it picked that whole south end of it up and twisted it like a pretzel, dropping it on the houses below. And August, to answer your question, reopened in June or July of 1905 after repairs. You'll see some repair pictures there too. This is the south end of the bridge, or over on the west side, looking just above the railroad tracks here, which you saw in the earlier picture of the destruction, looking towards this neighborhood.
Yeah, John.
So when that was reconstructed, the part that was reconstructed was constructed in steel and not wrought iron.
Yep.
And that was the part that was failing then just before they replaced the High Bridge.
Really? That's ironic. It's always the new construction that gives out first. We all know this. We restored our homes, right? So if this would be you in 1905, this is the celebration of the opening of the High Bridge in the first crossing right after the ribbon cutting. In those days, apparently, they cut the ribbon in the center of the bridge, which might have been a better idea in the summertime than in the wintertime. But, yeah. So, a few innovations on the High Bridge. The High Bridge was entirely cut off from the flats below, which became a problem, especially to the energy plant, which became NSP. First of all, in 1921, the Macmillan stairs were constructed towards the north end of the bridge, our end of the bridge, down to the flats. And then the second staircase was built later on, sometime in, I think, in the 1930s, closer to the NSP plant. Now, this had nothing to do with convenience for the folks living in Little Italy. This was more to do with NSP making sure its workers showed up on time, even during flood conditions. ultimately the McMillan stairs failed and I think were torn down in the 1950s. Probably, now I'm really dating people, you wouldn't know that. But wouldn't that have been a great amenity? They tell me something about ADA prohibits the hybrids from having a staircase down to the flats today, but I still personally regret that we don't have that connection down to the river flats.
When I moved to the neighborhood, that staircase was still in operation, and you would be on the bridge, you'd be crossing the bridge on your bike or walking or driving, you would see people walking up those stairs with their bicycles from the river below. So the link was an important link, and I really miss it.
So Jim, could you just point out that house that you pointed out to me that still exists in this picture?
This is interesting. Folks, if you have an opinion about this, you can express it to the right people too. You know, I'm a preservationist, but this is Little Italy at its height, taken in the 1940s or 50s here. And so many of these houses started out as one-room cottages, just like Sweet Hollow on the east side, one of the many immigrant settlements. We had over a dozen immigrant settlements scattered throughout the city, all of them with different connections to the countries from where the people came. This was, again, settled early by other groups, but then Italians mostly. And so all of these houses disappeared during the 1950s up to 1960s. The last house removed. This house here, very close to the bridge. Actually, people talked about standing on the bridge and taking rocks and trying to get them into the chimneys of the houses below. That's how close they were to the bridge. And literally at the railing here. This house was moved to Irvine Park as part of the Irvine Park National Historic District, moved up by the family who started building the house in 1900. And how they built their house, they talked to me about this, all the old ancestors. They said every piece of driftwood that would come down the river, we'd pick it up, dry it, and build an addition. We had enough wood. And finally they had a nice two-story house with an attached garage. The whole thing was stucco in good Italian style, good stucco. In fact, so many houses here because of the use of stucco, very popular with the Italians. And that house is on Ryan Street and was just written off by the Irvine Park Historic District and the Heritage Preservation Commission of the city. Said it's not important, simply not important, even though it's been part of the Historic District since the 1970s and been part of the neighborhood since it was built at the turn of the century by an immigrant family from Italy. That family still lives in the city. And I said, I don't care about your history. I felt really bad when I heard that because I thought the house was protected. It obviously isn't.
We don't just save the mansions, we save all houses of historic importance.
So I have a place in my heart for this house there.
Just want to point out two connections. You know, unfortunately, the bridge wasn't built in time for it to do anything at all for Waldmann Saloon. So I'm sure he would
Until now.
Until now, right, exactly. Actually, I'll point out this really odd fact. So, Waldmann Saloon has been open for a total of 6 years. So, 5 years in the 7 years now, right. 6 years with Anton Waldmann, 1857 to 1863. 1 year with me, oldest surviving commercial building on Smith Avenue or in the Twin Cities period. Highbridge has been around since 1889. They've never both been open until this week. Is that crazy or what? Anyway, two interesting facts though that connect this building with the Highbridge. The gentleman you're looking at here, John Rafter Jr., grew up in this building. His parents, John Rafter Sr., and his wife Catherine actually rented this as their house from 1897 to 1917. He was initially a stonemason, but later became a police officer, a beat cop up at the Rondo station here in St. Paul. Well, his son, John Rafter Jr., served in the Army Air Corps in Europe in World War I, flying Curtiss Jennies, as they were called. And after the war, continued as an amateur pilot in the Twin Cities. And at some point, I was told, actually, the funeral for the grandson was held in this building just this past July, so the family's very much interested in the building. And they relayed the story of how John Rafter, in order to impress his girlfriend, in approximately 1920, flew his Jenny under the Highbridge. And, just to make another record, is the only individual ever to have received a ticket for flying a biplane by the St. Paul police, who followed him to the landing strip afterwards. Interestingly, in the archaeology, it's fun when you can connect bits and pieces of what you find in the earth with documented history and yet alone family history like this. In the archaeology, we found a steel-minted German Kriegsgeld. It's a coin minted by the Weimar Republic in 1917 out of steel when Germany was so bankrupt they couldn't afford to pay their troops and fuel the economy with real money. That was found in the back lot. And I can't think of any other way a coin from Germany from 1917 would have arrived in this site other than through this gentleman as a souvenir of his war experience. Well, the second connection raises a lot of sadness that wasn't unique to the 19th century and unfortunately continues even to this day. And it's interesting how the High Bridge's use as an endpoint in people's lives has been viewed differently over the periods. In the 19th century, unfortunately, this was a subject of sensationalistic newspaper coverage. I will tell you that if you looked at the 1858 directory of the city of St. Paul, there is an outdated entry for this building that reflects the prior year. And in the prior year, the family that lived in this very building, their name was Amos, Jacob Amos, and his wife Catherine. And they had 5 boys, 2 of which they had in Indiana and brought with them to the city of St. Paul. Their eldest son's name was Jacob H. Amos. So we know Jacob H. Amos lived in this building as a young 5-year-old, and probably only for a few months. Later on, the family moved to 267 Van Hill. But as an older man, Jacob H. Amos, the son, and Jacob Amos was the stonemason for this project, his portrait is down in the front room, he became a cigar maker. And on October 30th, 1897, Jacob H. and his good friend Henry Bergenkruger had a few drinks at this place, which is the old Snelling House. This building still exists 4 doors north of us, folks. It was moved from Bonfie's Auto Garage to its current location in 1894. But this used to be the Snelling House. It was a boarding house and a little saloon. They had a couple of bumps in that house, and they walked all the way up the High Bridge together and had a couple more bumps at Piper's store. And then the newspaper recounts how they walked down midway the High Bridge at its highest point and dove 190 feet into the river together, holding hands. Now think about that. Frank Trinka, who is the 4th generation descendant of Jacob Amos, to whom this individual, Jacob H., would have been a great-great-uncle. When I shared that story with him, he said, "Liebestod, that's love's death." So, you know, these are really, really tough issues that continue to this day.
I'll just add something. Living on Smith Avenue for 36 years like I have, to see the changes in the current restoration of the bridge with the high fencing really creates some peace with me, because I can't tell you how many times in those 36 years that I followed people on the bridge. People in the middle of the winter that are there with no coat, who are ranting and raving or talking to themselves, or, you know, just distraught in some way, all hours of the day and night. Or how many times since the bridge the new bridge was there, that police have blocked it, and we've had sometimes hours and hours of talking people down. And I have to say, we all owe the greatest debt of gratitude to our St. Paul Police Department, Fire Department, that are out there dealing with people that are so distraught that in a split second they may take their lives. I watched one night where a man with a rifle, a fully loaded rifle in his arms, had already crawled over the railing, stood at the railing with this rifle, and they talked him back over. Imagine what kind of person that is that can do that. And they talked to him for hours and hours. It's something to behold. But that is just, we've had joggers just within the last year before the bridge was closed. They grabbed young people, teenagers who were going over, and grabbed them and held them till other help could arrive. So it's a huge, huge problem. huge problem. So when you read that in the paper, you have to understand the context of why those decisions were made here.
It's not only a historic place, but I would say it's a sacred place.
Yeah, sacred place.
Well, the denouement of the original High Bridge finally came in February of 1884. By that point in time, MDOT had control of the bridge and had done numerous structural surveys. Most of the joints of the bridge were totally locked, those expansion joints that I referenced earlier, to the point that it was in danger of structural collapse. That bridge decking, the cedar that I referenced, although that was taken out in the early 1960s, the underdecking was entirely deteriorated and there were open holes within the bridge. So it needed to be brought down. And on a single day, February 24th, 1985, after, mind you, a mock funeral held by the neighborhood, an actual hearse with an arrangement of flowers playing a dirge came down the High Bridge to memorialize the destruction of the High Bridge, and then several days later it came down. It came down so quickly, and Jim, you had a memory about this.
Two memories. First of all, during the funeral procession, that was a separate event, but funeral thing, there was two mayors, Mayor Scheibel and Mayor Latimer were there, I remember that. But the day of the demolition, 100,000 people showed up. Cars were parked, you couldn't move in the neighborhood, traffic was backed up for miles, and thousands and thousands on both sides were waiting and waiting and waiting all day. I had 25 guests, because I lived this close, literally within sight of the bridge. And my poor dog had been in that house all day, and I went in to let the dog out, and as soon as I closed my door to let the dog out, I heard the explosion and missed the whole thing. I thought I had it bad, and then I talked to Mayor Latimer, who was watching with his family from his back porch of his house on Linwood, overlooking the whole city, just absolutely perfect view of the bridge, just framing it. He said, "I'm going to go down and be in the crowds." He went down and got stuck in a traffic jam. Never saw it. Never saw it.
What year was that?
1984.
So I saw it from Irvine Park, and I remember there were people down around the yacht club in St. Paul. You were cordoned off, you couldn't get too close to it, but they experienced shrapnel that hit near the yacht club several blocks away.
Wow. Well, my only complaint is it took less to rebuild it entirely than it recently did to just redeck it, but I won't go there. So here is the bridge under reconstruction, and by some standards, a much more elegant bridge. The spans are much wider. We went from 27 piers to just 5. A glorious bridge indeed, no longer the second largest bridge in the country. It's way down on the list these days, but still a very, very important connector to communities. Jim, did you?
And the highway department was absolutely content to build just a concrete bridge. It's a really kind of just, nondescript bridge across this very important connection, and neighborhood said no. Neighborhood on both sides of the river said no, and there were committees in both neighborhoods that worked to help with the design of the bridge, and that's why it is a fairly elegant looking bridge today.
So I would just say that the real wins for the community were the sidewalks on both sides,
Yes.
the parks on both ends, and the fact that it became a 2-lane rather than 4-lane.
Fantastic. Yeah. Well, what would Mr. Waldmann have thought of all of this? Unfortunately, he left for Germany again in 1886, and so he never saw any of the bridge or heard any of the planning of the construction. But we can only guess that had he only known, he would have hung on to the real estate here on what's now Smith Avenue. I appreciate so much everybody coming out tonight and celebrating this important event with us. Do stick around. We've got marshmallow bridge building for the kids downstairs. We've got more of Dan Newton playing on the accordion downstairs, a bonfire in the side lot running all night, and just keep the beer and good food flowing, folks. Thank you.
Before want to do something I've been waiting to do for a long time. I believe that Tom has done more for Smith Avenue in this part of St. Paul than anybody in the last 100 years. And to take this building that would have literally disappeared, because again, it was just another old decrepit building in the neighborhood. But Tom came to this neighborhood 30 years ago, got active in preservation right away, and long before he got involved in this 8-year venture here to open this and restore this building, he worked with us all throughout this community as an attorney, working to save other historic structures. There was another historic structure on this site. He did not tear it down. He gave it away because he needed the space. He hit a little elbow room here, gave it away. That building was restored and is being lived in by a couple on Douglas Street right now. So tons and tons of just donated community involvement that has bettered our community. I moved here just a few years before him, but I've watched him since he came. He's just been a dynamo, and I want to give him a special
We'll now have a beer.